So I showed up to flight school and was just kind of jets or bust. I didn't even want to talk to people that didn't want to fly jets. And if you were on the fence, you were still kind of like, well, what's your point? Why are you here? Because in my mind, I couldn't conceptualize wanting to do anything else. So if you wanted to do something else, then that made you strange.
Everyone has a story to tell.
Stories of hardship, stories of hope,
stories of doubt, stories of faith.
But no matter the story,
these diverse experiences of military life
can all be found at the intersection of faith, family, and profession.
This is OCF Crosspoint.
Think about something in your life that you really, really wanted. It was always on your mind. And when you had the chance to finally grab hold of whatever it was you were wanting or striving toward, you came up short. Like literally, half a point painfully short. As we continue this multi-episode focus on the topic of identity, you're going to hear from Lieutenant Grant Johnson, United States Navy, as he shares his story of dreaming to be a jet pilot, only to come up short. And if you subscribe to OCF's Command magazine, then you might have seen the article on identity in the fall of 2020 that featured both Grant and his wife, Lieutenant Hannah Johnson. And you'll hear from Hannah in the next podcast episode. Today, Grant's going to unpack his story from that article in a bit more detail. You'll hear about how that experience of coming up short shook his faith and his identity, and also what he's still learning about himself. Let's jump into my conversation with Grant Johnson as he shares his story of military life at the intersection of faith, family, and profession.
I was born in Idaho, and then shortly thereafter, my parents moved back to Colorado because they both grew up in Colorado, and we bounced around all over the state. I think by the time I left for college, I had lived in like 8 different houses. Just Dad's work was taking us from place to place, and I'd had like this childhood dream of wanting to be a pilot. Honestly, I don't know if there's one incident that made that the childhood dream. Like, I couldn't tell you a time when I was little that I was like, when I grow up, I want to be a pilot. It was just something that sounded like a lot of fun because I had an uncle that was a crop duster, and I had a great uncle that was a World War II bomber pilot, and then went into the Air Force and did a career in the Air Force. So just growing up hearing those stories were just a lot of fun. And then I started looking into the Air Force Academy, being from Colorado, and Mom really wanted me to stay close for college. So that was a big drive for her. And I think it was spring of my junior year of high school, I went to an all-academy service day that they were hosting in southern Colorado. And, I talked to all the different recruiters that were there, really interested in the Naval Academy recruiters. And I talked to probably the West Point and Coast Guard guys for a little bit. And, everybody gave their spiel, and, nothing was really sticking out to me. And kind of felt like a loss of the day. And then I was literally leaving the room where all the briefs were being held. And this older gentleman stops me as I'm like walking out the door. And he's like, "Young man, I haven't talked to you." And I was like, "Yes, sir." And he's like, I realize you're leaving, but write down your name and number, and I'm going to call you back and tell you why you need to go to the Merchant Marine Academy." And I was like, in my mind, I was like, yeah, okay, like this guy's really going to do that. And lo and behold, he called me the next day, told me a little bit about himself. He was a retired colonel out of the Marine Corps, flew for the Marine Corps, went to the Naval Academy. Still to this day, I have no idea how he found out about the Merchant Marine Academy, which is what he was recruiting for. And I probably talked to him for 2 hours, and he asked me what my goals were. And then he told me how my goals would align with going to the Merchant Marine Academy. So being an engineer and then wanting to be a pilot. And I mean, really, I never looked back, mainly because this guy was so enthusiastic and he went out of his way to reach out to me. So I'm this kid from Colorado that's seen the ocean maybe once. I have never been to Long Island, which is where the school was, and I knew I was going to get an engineering degree and most likely fly for the Navy afterwards. So with that in mind, I left having zero idea what I was getting into. And I think my dad told me, I don't know if it was right before I'd started INDOC that summer before freshman year, or if it was sometime during freshman year, he just told me, keep an open mind on all the options. I know you want to fly, just keep an open mind, don't close any doors. And that just kind of stuck with me. So I went out to sea thinking, okay, could I do this for a career? Could I sail commercially for a career? Could I do some other form of engineering for a career? But anyway, so my senior year came around, and the other unique thing about the Merchant Marine Academy, besides for the full year out at sea, is that since they're funded Department of Transportation, you have to do some sort of military service, and it could be in any branch of the military that you get accepted to. So you apply for what you want, and if you get picked up and it's active duty officer, then that fulfills your commitment. Or you could go the reserves, which is what the majority of my classmates do. They IRR, individual ready reserves. They drill 2 weeks out of the year, and that's it. And they sail the rest of it. So I applied both Coast Guard aviation and the naval aviation, and that was a really interesting time, especially with my relationship with the Lord. It was kind of one of those of, okay, God, whichever one comes back first is the one I'm going to take. And then the Navy came back and said, hey, you got a flight slot. So yeah, I did the naval aviation route. And like I said, I wanted to be a jet pilot. I went to API in Pensacola. I was out there I sat for 6 months in A pool just because there was a large backup of students, and the lovely weather of Pensacola makes it hard to get students out during the summertime. So I sat for a bit, and then I went to primary in Milton to fly the T6. I think if you would ask me at the time, it was the best thing in the world. Looking back on it, it was probably the worst flying, most miserable for me anyways. And that's where I learned that I wasn't going to be a jet pilot. And I got picked up for helos, and then again did helos in Milton, and then picked up after that. After I got my wings, I went off to San Diego for my first fleet tour, and then now I'm here in Jacksonville as an FRS instructor for the MH-60 Romeo.
Grant, share your testimony with me. How did you become a believer?
Yeah, so I don't have a time, just like wanting to be a pilot. I don't have a time where I remember accepting Jesus as my savior. It was just one of those things that I knew. So there was no really one point where, I said the prayer to be a believer as a kid. I do remember making a conscious decision that I wanted to be baptized again, because I was baptized as an infant, but I wanted to be baptized again in 5th grade because the school or the church was doing a Bible 101 class, and at the end of it, you could be baptized again. So that was probably the most conscious decision, or at least outwardly expression of saying I believe in Jesus. But even before that, I still believed in Christ, and for as well as a 10-year-old or a 5-year-old could say they're going to heaven, that's what I would have told you. And then moving off to college, I think for faith-wise, it was a very scary experience, because I remember the summer before I left, I went on this whitewater rafting trip that the church did every summer. And towards the end of it, I remember being in tears because I was so afraid that I was going to lose my faith in college. Because when anybody talked about college, it was always this, you're off on your own, you don't have a structure, no one's telling you to go to church, so it's very easy to slide away from your faith. That scared me enough. It was probably not wholly me being afraid, but more maybe probably the Holy Spirit telling me hey, you need to be aware of what's going on. Again, 18-year-old me had no idea that's what it was, but looking back on it, definitely a part of it, the Holy Spirit just putting a need in me to want to continue community in a Christian relationship, or with Christ at the center. And luckily I went off to the Merchant Marine Academy, and they had this couple, we called a mom and dad Guest. Their last name was Guest, but they were highly active in the Protestant group at the Merchant Marine Academy, and they ran a Bible study and then a Sunday sermon, which was just a lot of fun. And they loved on us as much as they could, because most of us first time away from home, and they just really fed into our lives. And Dad Guest was a theologian, went to seminary to be a theologian. So we discussed theology all the time. So really growing my understanding of what it means to be a Christian, not drinking that milk, but actually, eating solid food of what it means to be a Christian. And then from there, went off to Pensacola. And I think I was in Pensacola for a month. And one of my classmates who was out there, she had found out about OCF, and she Facebook messaged me and said, hey, OCF's meeting tonight. If you'd like to come. And I said, cool, don't know what it is, but but there's going to be a meal involved and a Bible study, so count me in. And that was great. That's where I met some of my best friends, even that night. Like literally the first person I met there besides for the leaders was Adam Taylor. Goofy dude was asking just the funniest questions that in polite conversation, you wouldn't think you'd ask when you first met someone. And I think he just was, he's asking the questions that a fellow believer would ask someone who knows that they're a believer, that deep questions that matter, and not like, oh, how's your day? How's the weather been for you? And we just developed a great friendship and relationship that still maintained today. And OCF was huge. It was community. I mean, that's really what they're there doing. They're a community for those flight students, because flight school can be very dark for people. It can be very hard for people. And I think everybody struggles one way or another through flight school. And OCF is just a bunch of flight students with some wisdom of people who've been there, done that, to help guide people through what it means to start being a naval aviator. And then there was also a Bible study that was not affiliated with OCF. It was actually affiliated through a group called Ten Tavern Fellowship, which is a Marine Corps affiliated group. And they actually had a house out there that flight students would rent out. But the house was meant to be an open house for really anybody in the military to just take rest at. But the next part, I guess, of my testimony is the going from wanting to be a jet pilot and then not becoming a jet pilot. So, but it was the OCF and the men from the Ton Tavern Fellowship were just pivotal in my transition from, hey, I wanted to be this jet pilot, to now I can't be a jet pilot. And because everybody's in the same circumstance and everybody's at the same place in life, just people were able to help me through that and see that God had something better for me.
Okay, since we're focusing on the topic of identity, how would you describe or define yourself right now? And before you answer, let me ask it this way. If someone said, hey, Grant, give me a 2-minute elevator speech, what would yours sound like?
So I would say that I am a struggling believer that's also accidentally a helicopter pilot. Yeah, my wife laughs because it's kind of funny. But yeah, so right now specifically, I'm an instructor pilot, which I absolutely love teaching people, which I probably would have never have thought I would have said ever. And I'm married to my wife, and we are trying to figure out what it means to be in the world and not of it, what it means to be in community, especially during this time of physical community is not necessarily what people want, but we definitely still feel a need towards that.
I want to circle back to something you said earlier, and it's the part of your story where your dream was to be a fighter pilot, but you came up short. Talk more about that experience and the effect it had on your identity.
So I wanted to be a fighter pilot. I wanted to be the guy that was landing on the carrier, taking off from the carrier, launching warheads on foreheads is what we like to say. So that was what I thought I wanted to do. And I probably hadn't done any more research outside of that, which in hindsight I probably should have done. But I had a mentor in high school that he was a naval officer. Honestly, I don't know what he did in the Navy. He's not in the Navy anymore when I knew him, but he kind of knew the mentality of a jet fighter pilot in the Navy. And he said, you need to be a go-getter. You need to know what you want and always be striving towards that goal. And if anything keeps you from that, then you need to jump over those hurdles or move those hurdles in order to make that happen. So 18-year-old me heard that, and then 22-year-old me going into flight school interpreted that as, okay, I need to do whatever it takes, say the words that need to be said, and almost to the point of ignore the relationships that shouldn't be ignored to become a jet pilot. Like, it's my career, and my career, I need to be a jet pilot. And I emphasize the I because there was no prayerful consideration. I mean, in college, there was the I was praying towards, like, should I go into the Coast Guard? Should I go into the Navy? But still in the back of my head, it was like, well, the Coast Guard doesn't fly jets. So I showed up to flight school and was just kind of jets or bust. I didn't even want to talk to people that didn't want to to fly jets. And if you were on the fence, you were still kind of like, well, what's your point? Why are you here? Because in my mind, I couldn't conceptualize wanting to do anything else. So if you wanted to do something else, then that made you strange. And then, as I mentioned, the Ten Tavern Fellowship Monday night men's Bible study that we went to, there was a lot of people who were ahead of me, and a lot of times people would say I got God's choice for me, because they selected their pipeline that they were going to go fly, and it wasn't necessarily what they wanted, but it was God's choice. And every time that was said, it just kind of rubbed me funny. And at the time I thought like, oh, God's choice, like it's your choice. Like you were the one who had the influence to get better grades or do the things that you needed to do to get the thing that you wanted. So I wasn't necessarily looking down on those people, but I wasn't really accepting what they were saying. And as my buddies would say it, I was a complete jerk when it came to talking about like wanting to fly jets. Like I'm pretty sure they just like stopped talking about that stuff with me because I was just so enamored with wanting to fly jets and doing what I needed to in flight school that my friends just didn't talk to me about it. I mean, they were absolute saints because they still put up with me, which looking back on it, I don't know why they put up with me, but they did. And the warning signs there were, like I said, I was willing to step over relationships or ignore relationships and even ignore my faith in order to become that jet pilot. I didn't see those as warning signs at the time, but there was definitely, my friends out there and the mentors that were out there that were just gently feeding me the truth of, your identity is not wrapped up in the aircraft that you're flying. So I went through primary, and being on this side of it, I struggled. I absolutely struggled through primary. And I wouldn't have said that then while I was going through it or even after I'd completed it, but I did not enjoy it. The T6 was not a fun aircraft to me, and I struggled every minute through it. And then I completed that portion, and they like set you down, make you fill out a bunch of surveys, and then at the end of it, they tell you your grades that you got. And the grades are very important because that determined where you were going to go. So for the Navy, you have to get a 50 NSS to go jets because it's a bell curve grading system, a 30 through an 80, and 50 is average. So you needed a minimum of 50 to even be considered to go down the jet pipeline, assuming the Navy had spots for jet pilots. So I finished my surveys, and I distinctly remember where I was sitting, and then the guy that came up and whispered in my ear and smelled like cigarette smoke as he whispers into my ear, "Hey, you got a 49.5 for your grades." And I think I heard him, but it took me, probably a minute to be like, wait, that doesn't line up with anything that I wanted or had heard, because I had an instructor that I looked up to that in primary, you have an instructor that follows you through, that flies a lot with you. And so my on-wing, he even told me like, "Hey man, don't worry about your grades. Like, don't worry about it. You'll get what I probably heard him say you'll get what you want, but it was probably something more of like, hey, you'll get what you're supposed to get." So in my mind, the instructor who sees behind the curtain knows that I'm going to get the grades that I need to select jets. So it was one of this of like, that can't be right, And then it finally set in, and I was just in a fog after that for probably the next 2 days of like this can't be reality. Like my reality's been changed. So what I'm living in that can't be right. That's not what I've spent the last 18 months believing. And I think I was probably really quiet and didn't say much because I was living in the Ten Tavern house at the time with my best friends, and we'd gone through a lot together. And I think they gave me the space that I needed, and they didn't really say anything because they could have easily been like, "We told you, dude, like, this is what you get, and now you have to live with it." But they were very gracious to me and showed me a lot of grace, which is what I needed at the time. And, I think it was 4 weeks from finding out my score to then checking into HTs to fly helicopters, and then another 3 weeks after that before I started flying. And Man, I think when I checked into HTs, I had the attitude of, I said earlier, my dad said, just be open to anything. So I think I adopted that attitude of like, okay, I'm going to accept my reality. It's not what I wanted, but I'm going to accept it. And I'm going to at least be here and try and see what this is all about. So I'd kind of gotten over that idea of, I wasn't wallowing in my self misery as much. So I was ready to be there and learn. And, going back to my engineering, the helicopter aerodynamics was a lot of fun to learn, which I know a lot of people are going to cringe when they hear that, but I really enjoyed learning it. And then I had my first helicopter flight, and the instructor takes off, and then you take off and you start flying, and it's like flying an airplane. A little bit different, but basically the same. Like there's not really a whole lot of skill that we don't already have to actually fly a helicopter. But then we got to the airfield that we were going to do our hover work, and man, he passed me the controls, and I think after like 20 seconds, that helicopter was careening towards the ground, and we were about to die. And this guy's the calm voice that says, "Okay, I have the controls," and he just steadies it right back out. And I was sold. Like it was night and day. Like this was 100% the best thing I'd ever done, and I was ready to be there, and I was excited to be a helicopter pilot. And it just switched. It switched after that 30-second experience of almost dying, and the calm voice coming over the ICS saying, my controls, and we'll try this again. And I have not looked back since. There's still a part of me that sees the jet guys take off, and they still look the coolest. It hurts for me to say that, but it's just there's something slick to it. But it was just a process. I think I had to mourn I had to mourn that circumstance of my realizing that I'm not as good, or I'm not necessarily my desires for my life are not necessarily what God's going to have for my life. So I had to mourn that circumstance. And then the hindsight of it, because I think about this a lot, because, I'm still a helicopter pilot. So, I, I have to thank God that He allowed me to have the experiences that I did. And then when I did sit in that helicopter the first time, it was the most fun I've ever had flying. And I was brand new. I was awful at it, like awful, like below average on my hovering skills. So for all intents and purposes, I should have been hating it. I should have not liked that experience, but it was a lot of fun. It was a challenge. So my friends, through the 10 more months of learning how to fly helicopters, they were very kind and just allowed me to process out loud with them this idea of flying helicopters versus not flying helicopters. And they just let me talk, really. I mean, there was no telling me I'd done something wrong or telling me how life was going to be, but they just allowed me to work through that and pray with me through like what life now looks like as a helicopter pilot. And I distinctly remember, I think probably 6 months before I'd been told I couldn't be a jet pilot, that we, in the Stronghold Bible study, the Monday night men's Bible study that we were at, we were studying, I always forget, Esther. Yeah, Esther. We were studying Esther, and, kind of funny that a bunch of flight school students, all macho males, are studying Esther. But I just remember that study stuck with me through my time, realizing that my identity had been shifted, because Esther, like, she just said, "Okay, God, like, I'm yours to use," and just kind of like there was no complaining in it. She just knew that that's where she needed to be, and that lesson didn't stick then. But when I looked back on it throughout the 10 months of learning to fly helicopters, like that lesson came to the forefront of my head, where God and the Holy Spirit is like, okay, like now is your time to be okay with where you're at, and you're going to enjoy it. And the proof was there that I was going to enjoy it, because I was enjoying it.
You said that you mourned, past tense. Are you saying that the mourning period is over, that there's no more mourning the loss of, oh no, I'm never going to be a jet pilot, and you've moved past that?
Yeah, I would say that the mourning time is over, because I don't mourn that circumstance anymore, because I realize how God has worked my life in the last 5 years to put me into the situation where I am. And if any of that was changed, life wouldn't look the way that it looks. Like I would not have met Hannah. Hannah would not be my wife if I would have been a jet pilot, or my path would have been any different than what it is currently. So I said that I still think it's kind of cool to watch the jet guys do what they do, but I very much like where I'm at, and I don't really look back on that circumstance, right? I don't mourn that circumstance. I think if anything, I celebrate it because it's a way to share my story, a way to share my testimony, and a way to encourage others who, because I'm still in this game of flying. I'm still a naval aviator, and I'm around students that aren't necessarily where they want to be, or I'm around other instructors that aren't necessarily where they want to be. So it's just a way to encourage those around me. So it's hard for me to mourn something if I'm using it to encourage others.
Grant, what have you learned about your identity? What are you still learning, and what are you still struggling with?
I think I've learned the last, at least coming out to Jacksonville and being an instructor, and no longer being in the, quote unquote fleet where I'm deploying, that identity is, I think it's a constantly, not necessarily changing, but it needs to be evaluated very routinely. So what I mean is that there should be a base understanding of what your identity is rooted in, to use that language, or what the bottom layer of your identity means. But then I have to constantly evaluate what is God showing me that I'm doing in my life that's a part of my identity, either for His glory or not. So the base layer should surround something towards what God has for me for His glory. And so right now that's being a man after His own heart, and loving my wife and the family that He might give us, and then doing my job. So like that job portion at least is always kind of changing. The target is always kind of changing. And then I think from the lesson learned from, my flight school experience is not holding on to it so tightly that it bumps up in the priority level. So it's hard for me to talk about identity without talking about like what are the priorities in my life. So if the number one priority is work, then my identity is wrapped up in work, and then my identity would be incorrect if that was the first priority. But I still think it's okay to say that part of my identity is in work, or right now in being a flight instructor for a season, and knowing that seasons will always change, but God's faithfulness will never change. So that's the number one priority there. So that should be what my identity is wrapped up in, to have a correct identity.
Right.
What I struggle with, I think right now I've been struggling with I don't know if passiveness is the right word, but I guess passiveness. I go with the flow mentality where, I'm not being intentional with how I'm defining my life, or I'm not being intentional with my relationship with Hannah, and I'm not maintaining the priorities the way that they need to, and just kind of letting them flow freely. And I don't know if I have an answer to how to fix that, because I don't want to go back to the other end and be so hard pressed towards one answer for identity, or one answer for, having the right answer, proceeding with my identity one direction, where I hold on to it so firmly that I'm, again, hit over the head with the 2x4, like I did with not getting jets, and just being shown that I did something wrong. So I guess right now I'm in a little bit of that fear stage of, I'm afraid of getting it wrong again. So that's showing itself as in action.
Grant, let's wrap up our conversation with a question I like to ask all my guests. If listeners were going to take away only one thing from your story today, what would you hope that it would be?
It's important to think about and to know, or at least to have ideas of what your life is going to look like. And I think it's very much okay to have dreams and desires, especially when it comes into like what are you going to do with your career, or the big life decisions. It's okay to have those dreams, but I think for me, I have to sit back and assess where those are coming from. Where's my heart at when it comes to looking at what I want my identity to shape out to be, or what my identity is currently. So yeah, the takeaway is you have to filter that through the correct filter. Because, for me, that filter is talking it out loud with mentors and with peers and with my wife, because I have to say something out loud in order to understand what I'm doing or understand what I believe. But I mean, that can look different for any number of people. So my way isn't necessarily the correct way, but it just needs to be filtered through a correct source, or through the correct meanings. And really, that filter should be biblically centered, should be rooted in Christ, to figure out that identity, to figure out those priorities, and then holding on to whatever happens loosely, because life never comes at you the way that you really want it to, or even the way that you expect. And from my story, it really hurt when it changed. And I think if I would have had a correct attitude and correct focus and correct priority at the time, then it wouldn't have hurt as much. And then, when those things do happen, because they will happen, like we're still human, we're still sinful this side of glory. So you have to take those experiences and learn from them. And that's where the growth is going to come from. So it's all give and take. Know that those lessons will come, learn from them, and then move on, knowing that God has you where he has you, and that he's growing you, and you should take joy in that.
OCF Crosspoint is a production of Officers Christian Fellowship. For more information about OCF, check us out online at ocfusa.org, or find us on Facebook and Instagram at OCFUSA. This episode was hosted and produced by me, Josh Jackson. Audio cleanup and repair was done by Michael Jerry of Mighty Productions. If you have an idea for a guest, topic, or story that you think should be considered on a future episode, send an email to podcast@ocfusa.org. Thanks for listening, and be sure to join us for the next episode of OCF Crosspoint.